The strategic challenge was reinvention of the business because it had to. There was a fire burning, so we needed to address that. But at the same time, looking for the opportunity in what was there, how that aligned to our core skills, which I have to say we probably fundamentally underestimated, how good we were at what we were doing.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Patrick Heath-Lay, Chief Executive Officer of People's Partnership, the organization behind the People's Pension, one of the UK's largest workplace pension schemes. Since becoming CEO in 2012, Patrick has led the organization through a remarkable period of transformation, scaling the People's Pension into a national platform serving millions of members. Having started his career in the organization's postroom at just 16, his journey reflects a rare combination of deep institutional knowledge and long-term stewardship. Patrick, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you, Belden. Nice to see you.
Really great to have you here. I wonder, just to get us started, if you give us a sense of sort of People's Partnership today, what does it do? Who does it serve? And what's the role it plays in the overall UK pension system?
Yeah, well, look, People's Partnership is a really significant organisation. It's run on a profit-to-member or not-for-profit basis. It emerged from the construction industry, where it looked after blue-collar workers, on-site construction workers. And now it runs the People's Pension. That is a large-scale master trust workplace pension scheme, serves over 7 million members, has around 40 billion of assets under management. Mm-hmm. It's looking after over 100,000 employers. So it's a very significant scale workplace pension scheme that really emerged on the back of the government's push for automatic enrolment, where everyone that goes into a workplace should have the entitlement to get a workplace pension. And we've seen some phenomenal growth over that period. As I say, the organisation is very special because I've been here a long time, but it's gone through a number of iterations. Yeah, it's playing a fantastic role, I think, right now, particularly with the government's further reform of pensions that's going on.
So I want to get into the history and kind of heritage of the organisation in a minute. But before we do, for any of the folks who might be listening who aren't from the pensions world, could you just explain what's a master trust and what does that even mean? How does it work? What does it do?
This is one of the interesting things where we kind of get a bit obsessed, don't we, in our respective roles, talking about the intricacies. And actually, to most people, a pension's a pension, when you're a saver. So master trust is a trust base. So we have a group of trustees that oversight the activities of the pension scheme, and they take on a very special role in terms of ensuring, in effect, everything that we do, that there's a really good outcome for members. That's really what they're trying to drive at: good quality value for money for members, and that they ensure that we run it in the right way. But obviously we have commercial boards, we have funding kind of conversations that we have to do to actually put into the vehicle. But there's this lovely healthy tension between how we run in a master trust, between where the trustees are coming from and where we're trying to get to. And obviously as a purposeful organisation, we share a common purpose with the trustees, which is benefit of the member. That is different to perhaps some of the historic predominant practice of contract-based pensions, which is where a lot of the insurance companies come from. Mm-hmm. They have run historically contract-based arrangements, which don't necessarily have an independent group of trustees. They do have something called independent governance committees that look at them, but they don't quite have the same powers. But again, people could be saving through any of those vehicles, and it's their pension money at the end of the day, which is quite common. But master trusts have really risen on the back of automatic enrolment because they're more seen as, a more efficient vehicle to deliver mass market pensions. So we've seen a particular increase in the number of master trusts that are in the market, and they're a real growth sector.
And if I understand it right, you sort of touched on this. It seems to me that for some people anyway, they think, I have an employer, I have a pension with that employer. When I move to a different employer now, I've got something completely different. I've got to write. Part of what master trusts do is they somehow work with many more than one. I think you mentioned 100,000 employers. So does all that money kind of get lumped together then and invested sort of where you can use the scale of having that bigger pile of money.
Yeah, it's a multi-employer scheme in effect, where each scheme has a particular section of the trust in terms of, we're running schemes for each employer. But overall, what we do, and this is a little bit, this is not common, put it this way, but what we do is we try and ensure that every time we see a member coming through whichever employer it is, because obviously a lot of the businesses we look after are quite transient workforces, similar to our history in construction. We match the member to their records. So effectively, we carry one policy. What we try to do is carry one policy per member, regardless of which employer they go to. But from an employer's perspective, yes, they have their own kind of part of the trust. However, when it comes to where the money is invested, that is into predominantly one default fund. Members have choice where the money can go. We offer a small range of funds, but most people will follow the default. So that means about 98, 99% of the funds that actually come in the door go into one central default fund. And that's important because you can get real scale through that. You can really, as an asset owner, which is another important difference here, as an asset owner, that means we don't earn anything commercially out of the investing process. So our only job is to find the right investments through the right manager at the right terms for the benefit of the member. And that's really, really important and aligns nicely to why we exist.
You touched on a little bit the history, sort of started off with some roots in the construction world, but at some point it clearly changed. What caused that change?
The origins of the business were, as I said, set up by the construction industry and actually an agreement between trade unions and employers within the industry, which really reflected the fact that so many construction workers were effectively following where the work was. And this was during the war, actually, 1942, when the business was set up. They go where the work is, but actually every time they left an employer, they weren't paid for outstanding holidays. They never got paid for a holiday. And that's the origin of it. And actually there was a piece of tax legislation that existed that said if employers contribute to a centralized holiday pay fund in respect of individual workers, at the point that they then get time to take holiday, they can get that paid. But there was a national insurance concession that came with it. So effectively, the employer saved a little bit of money on the money they paid, and the employee saved as well when they were in receipt of holiday pay. So that's the origin of it. But really behind that is this sense that actually blue-collar workers, particularly on construction sites at that time, just didn't have any sense of financial benefit. That, they're operating at risk, particularly in a pre-mechanization world. The health and safety rules are nowhere near that, and they're very much exposed to a lot of financial risk. So trade unions, employers coming together and saying, actually, we'll put something in place that at least addresses the holiday pay part. And then they built upon that through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, where they started adding other financial, I would call core financial welfare benefits, if you like. So life cover, accident cover, pensions. And that's how the organisation evolved. But it was all under the umbrella of construction. And it very much utilised this tax concession that existed in legislation at that time to get participation in the scheme. And it was very, very successful. We built a lot of big benefits to people that were really underserved by financial services over that time. What triggered it was a change in legislation. And we'd been working on things within the organisation where we were very aware that, post-working time directives and things like that from European law, that actually workers were now entitled to holiday pay. When you leave employment now, it happens. You move from one employer to another, you get paid your outstanding holiday leave. That did not used to be the case. So this piece of tax legislation that was kind of advocating use through centralised holiday pay schemes may suddenly become undone. Because why would a chancellor maintain that when it's being used by commercial businesses just to avoid paying some national insurance? Whereas with, construction had really built a whole ecosystem of bringing benefits to the underserved. So that actually got taken away in the late 2000s, and the Chancellor stood up at the dispatch box and took that away. What was really good about the government at the time is it gave construction 5 years to move away from. And that was really important because it gave us an opportunity then to develop our own strategy internally and to actually instigate that. And obviously at that point, automatic enrolment was coming up on the rails. It would be implemented eventually in 2012. And so the time horizons really kind of uniquely came together on the 1st of October 2012, where effectively the holiday pay initiative wound up, the tax saving that everyone was experiencing wound up. All of a sudden, the other benefits we were offering became a real cost. But at the same time, there was now an obligation on employers to focus on pensions. And we took the pivot through that time. We had a number of iterations of strategy, considered very strongly whether we stayed within construction or we pivoted, as we eventually did, to offer a whole of market solution. And there were a number of competitive factors for that. But eventually we did do that and launched the People's Pension on the 1st of October 2012. And that has just gone from strength to strength. But it's the strategic challenge was reinvention of the business because it had to. There was a fire burning. So we needed to address that, but at the same time looking for the opportunity in what was there, how that aligned to our core skills, which I have to say we probably fundamentally underestimated how good we were at what we were doing. But it all came together. And as I say, I mean, could look back now, but it's been a really interesting journey and a really interesting story, I think, in the history of the business.
I don't want to dwell on it too long, but it does sound like you sort of talked about a number of things coming together. I suspect in retrospect, it all seems like it made sense. But as you're heading into it, I can imagine it was like, well, some of this feels a bit risky, do we go this way or that way? Was there something that for you kind of led you to be confident enough anyway, that the direction you were going was the right one?
Yeah, I mean, look, you alluded to the fact that I've grown up in this organisation. Yeah. And so I always had a sense that the organisation could do more. It had the capability of doing more. It had, and obviously at this time I'm not CEO, so I don't have the ability to kind of shape that too much. But from within, had that feeling it could do more. But somehow, because of the frame of working in construction, we were limited in just how far we could go.
Right.
So actually the circumstances of saying actually the operating model within construction needed to be changed. And we did. I mean, we did intend with the strategy to stay on pensions within construction. We didn't originally say we would focus on automatic enrolment pensions outside. But the competitive pressures of watching other organisations come into our construction employers and offer them pensions suddenly meant, actually, why are we limiting ourselves? Why can't we flip this on its head and go whole of market? And there was a few moments in strategy where we had some great conversations where we had to flip the model and say, do you know what? We're going to go a different way, and we now need to persuade the board, because it's a tough thing, that they need to abandon just construction for pensions and we need to go whole of market. And so there were a couple of pivotal moments in that really did do that. But the threat of competition and sudden realization that we had a business that was under threat really motivated to actually say, how do we get this on the right path? How do we now respond? And of course, there's bound to be moments in there you don't know. I never knew whether what we had when we launched People's Pension would really be that appealing to businesses.
But and one thing I really love in that little bit of the story you told is something that I think in some ways it seems so easy, and yet I know it can be so difficult, is that reframing of a threat into an opportunity. That, oh no, there's people coming into our business. Well, hang on a minute. If they're coming into ours, can we go into theirs? And sometimes I've seen boards get so focused in on the risk, the threat, that they almost can't see the opportunity. So again, I won't necessarily probe how you got that to happen unless you want to share it, but it does sound like there must have been some interesting conversations with the board along the way.
Yeah, there were. I mean, look, having a big threat or a fire, as I say, blazing, you'll find a lot of businesses, they can move very, very well when that threat is there. When you actually harness it to seize the opportunity. If you get, as you say, too absorbed into the threat and trying to work out how to remove the threat, you miss the opportunity.
Yeah.
So I think there is a careful balance in that. Yes, there were some difficult conversations, but I think the board really did embrace the fact that actually we needed to sustain the model for construction. And don't forget, as an organisation, we are still serving tens of thousands of construction workers for an accident product and a life product. Those things still exist. So the success of People's Pension has enabled us to continue to offer those fundamental core benefits for construction. But yeah, it's often, I agree with you, it's often too easy to be too self-absorbed on the risk and not see the opportunity. And then you have to flip the mindset. So I have to pursue the opportunity because that in itself will mitigate the risk rather than just focusing on the risk and trying to get out of that particular position. So yeah, it's been a journey, as they say in Strictly World, but it's been a really good one.
And if you don't mind, let me kind of just ask for you to share a little bit about your own journey. As you might imagine, before we hopped on this conversation, I took the opportunity to do a little bit of digging around the internet, and one of the descriptors I got back was that you're a unicorn, which I assume that means not worth $1 billion, though maybe you are, but more a fairly unusual animal. And having spent 40 years at the same organization, just interested to hear, did you ever think you were going to be there that long? Did it do you learn anything about staying in one place so long that's worth sharing? And if you don't mind my asking, are you aiming for 50?
Yeah, it has been an interesting journey. And I think, look, my journey and the business's journey is intertwined, and it's very difficult sometimes to unpick those things. Sure, there's been times in that journey, because I arrived into the workplace, not with a strong educational background at all. And if you think about how business life today, it's all about getting to university, it's getting great degrees, it's getting in the ladder and the corporate ladder and working. And my journey is just completely different to that. There would have been times in my career where I would have thought, well, actually, it's time to move to another organisation. And then the organisation presented me with another challenge, and that was great. So they really have tried to support me in my development. I've trained as an accountant here. I've got professional qualifications behind me, but more than that, I think I've got quite a big breadth of experience across a number of different disciplines, which helped me, I think, today. Yes, there are moments in that journey where, as I say, it's fairly intertwined. That 1st of October 2012 being the day when our previous activities in construction ceased, and when our systems went live for the People's Pension, also happened to be the first day I was chief executive and was my birthday. So there are so many things that I kind of, when I think of it coming together, is kind of like, I don't know how you could write a script for something like it. But at the same time, I'm very conscious it's not me that's made this happen. It is a business, it's a movement, it's a purpose that's really been behind every strategic decision that we've taken. So whilst I've been on that journey and I've been privileged enough to be on it, I am very conscious of the fact that it's not just about one individual that makes a business successful. There've been many people that have contributed to it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that. But I think there is a slight difference, I suspect, in me, because it perhaps changes that perception that you have to get the best education, or you have to, climb the ladder and have the biggest ego and the biggest leadership, credentials. And actually, quietly, you can go about maybe doing it a little bit different. And I think I've done, particularly in the last few years, is a lot of reflections from me, because obviously trying to keep up personally with a business that's doing what it's doing is a challenge. And there are moments you have in that where you get lots of feedback, and you got to listen and you got to learn from that. And it's hard sometimes when you think, actually, this is a really tough job, and just staying aligned to what we're doing. But it's really important to continue that learning and to listen for the things that really help you, because as an organisation, we've been on such a transformation. You're really just keeping pace with it is a challenge personally, but I've loved it. I've got lots of things that I can fall back on that are really helpful. But I've got a fantastic team around me that really know what they're doing, and just allow me to move my own leadership on and move my own role as CEO onto a different plane, because, I don't have to do the things I was doing 2-3 years ago, and I need to learn and move myself forward.
One of the things I hear in what you've said there is part of it sort of a conjunction of two things. One is clearly you were someone who, wherever you were, felt like there ought to be more. There ought to be more for the organization. There ought to be more for me. There ought to be more for other people. That whatever's happening here doesn't have to be the end of it. It can get better. But it also sounds like there was something in the organization that, maybe not at every moment, but certainly at key moments, gave you the context, the support, the encouragement, whatever, to do that, to get the qualification, to take the next step. Is there something do you think it's sort of somehow in the heritage of the organization itself, or, what led to that? Put differently, if you're a CEO somewhere else, how do you create the circumstances that people think year after year, this is where I want to be, this is the right place for me?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, the organisations historically had, I think there's a challenge in here, Belden. I think you have to, particularly when you start becoming successful, you have a cultural challenge as you shift through. So the organisation has always had a very family feel to it, if you like. I've heard it talked about a little bit civil service historically, which would probably be true. But it had a softer side to its culture that really enabled it to be very member-centric, want to do the right thing for customers, would go the extra mile, even if that was quite inefficient, to ensure that the right outcome was achieved. And so that sense of purpose and sense of belonging resonated quite strongly with me when I was growing up through the organisation. I think that the interesting challenge has been over the last particularly 5-6 years of how you introduce a much more commercial view of what you're doing, but not lose sight of that core purpose and core set of values, because it's very easy to destroy one or the other. So there's a ruthless efficiency you're trying to deliver. At the same time, you're not trying to deliver the point that when a customer shows up in a moment of truth and they need your support, you're there and you'll take as long as it needs to make sure they get the outcome that they need. So that's a really quite difficult tension when you're trying to balance it through. There is a lot to do with the core set of values here. And one of my learnings was, and I never knew how important it was, when I took the seat in 2012, there were 8 values on the wall in this office that I looked at every day and thought, I don't recognize some of those. I don't understand. And then there's a phrase, you know, it's a kind of, it was laminated and not lived. You know, it looked good, but actually it didn't resonate with me as to why. And I've been with the organisation obviously a long time. And I went through an exercise quite early on where I thought, do you know what? I want to take them off the wall. They're frustrating me. I want something up there I can believe in. And went through a process, came up, we had 3 values on the wall. They have stayed true throughout the whole journey. And they are pretty simple in the way that we think about things, but they have been pretty much a life belt between where we were in construction and what we're doing in the whole of market. And also that route between sort of cultural move from being quite soft and, you know, nice to deal with to actually more commercially orientated, perhaps a little bit more ruthless in our thinking. Come back to those 3 values about, are we keeping our promises and are we creating simplicity in what we do? And look, we're not there yet as a business. We need to continue that journey, but they have proved to be a real lifeboat on that journey.
Yeah. And what's the strategy now?
The strategy now is, I mean, we're in a time of great change from this government. Regardless of your politics, they have decided to pull pension policy central to how you fuel economic growth in your home market. Now, there's lots of things around that, and there'll be a few controversial things that are currently in the pension bill around, you know, how much do you influence or mandate pension schemes to invest towards your home market, particularly when you're not incentivizing that through normal tax breaks or anything like that. So that's a challenge. But a lot of the other stuff in what this government are doing is they're saying, actually, we need smaller number of bigger, better value pension schemes with bigger pools of capital that are prepared to invest in a different way. You know, they're not just buying products off the shelf of investment managers. They're actually creating investment vehicles that are trying to drive at real growth and getting more of that into private market investments. So it's a really interesting time, because what that does for us is say, actually, I'm going to turn the pensions industry a little bit on its head and challenge it. Now, for our model, which is different, so we're pretty streamlined, profit to member. We're the only big scale profit to member that can actually show profit and how it's delivering it back to members. It puts us in a kind of a unique position, I think. And so actually having a market that's challenging itself about how it operates creates risk, as we started with. But guess what? It creates a lot of opportunity as well. So you have to kind of balance that whole dynamic through. So the strategy is very much about how we secure the strength and growth that we have. We want to retain our customers. We want to pull them through this whole changing landscape. But we recognise there could be increased opportunity from consolidation, just generally the industry changing the way it thinks and culturally deals with pensions. It's not just about the system, it's also about the culture. So I think there's great opportunity ahead for a big scale player like us to play its part in delivering pension saving for the UK population, and in an environment which is consolidating down fewer schemes, better quality, value for money driven models. I think we're in an excellent position to take advantage of that.
I want to, if you don't mind, just understand a little bit more about what I might describe as the business model. So yeah, I think you mentioned earlier that perhaps unlike others, you're not getting revenue, you're not getting compensation from the decisions you make about investment allocation and how that works. But obviously you've got to be getting revenue from somewhere because you have to pay people. So yes. Where does the income come from? Where does the revenue come from? And how does all that fit into thinking about value for money?
So putting aside, we still have some activities within construction, which obviously we have premiums coming in the door, of which we will make a margin on the premium. But this is a relatively thin margin business. We're talking about providing financial products to some of the most challenging employment environments, and at a good, reasonable cost. So this is why scale is important. You have to have scale because it's very thin margin business, but you need to do it on a larger scale and have that balance. So the business model is effectively, and think about how a pension works. People save their money into a pension. That is for a desired return. But actually, we have a charge overall. So we charge through the pricing of the unitization of the pension product. There is a charge. Basic price is roughly 50 basis points that comes into the business, and that covers the administration cost. That covers the investing process. It covers all aspects of the running of effectively the proportion of the group that is devoted towards the people's pension. So there is a charge within the pricing, and that's how all pension providers work. But this is why the shift to value is really interesting at the moment, because, historically, I think the industry, and if I talk about the pensions industry, one thing is it's typically been there for the more wealthiest in society. That's why automatic enrolment came in. That's why the government legislated for those things. It has a base of players that are very used to operating in that market, but are selective in the type of business that they will write. And that is largely because their models are driven towards shareholders. When you start to knit together where the pensions industry has been, where it's now being asked to go with the government focusing on value for money, this is starting to centre the conversation down to what is the fundamental reason why a pension exists, why a pension company exists. And it is surely the main things, the way I look at it, is to say, if you give me £1 to invest for your pension, for your future, and you're largely going to give that to me and not worry about it. I mean, you're give it to me and just expect it to happen. It's going to come out your payslip and someone's going to do something good with this. Then I need to be accountable for the amount I will give you back on top of that pound when you come to retire, for the charge that I make to you within how I price it. So effectively, the net benefit I return back to you is the really critical factor here. I think that, as well as when you need me as a provider, how I show up in that moment of truth, I would describe it, I think are important. And this is where, again, current regulatory drive is much more towards these are the important factors when you judge value for money. You might also judge value on many other factors. How nice your app is and interactive to deal with, how you're showing up in some of your brand or help and guidance that you provide. Again, really important value aspects. But the way I think about it is, if I can't justify myself on the first two, which is the net benefit of what I give you back and how I show up in those moments of truth when you need me, I'm not sure why I should place a huge amount of value on everything else, because I can't do the basics of why I'm providing a pension for you. So I think there's a nice tension in where this is going, and why our model, I think, is a good model for the future, is because that is its sole focus. It's the member, what we return, and how we support them in the right way. And so we're not driven by, what other margins we have to make to give to shareholders or whatever else. So those things are really, really important. And as I say, value is currently being judged in our industry across multiple factors. But I think the current drive of policy and regulation is really trying to get us to focus on why do we exist.
Yeah. We've talked a couple of times about sort of showing up in moments of truth. And I think I suspect for you, when you say those words, a whole set of kind of scenarios and situations and people come to mind. So if you could you give us a couple examples, and then also help me understand, how do you replicate what must be a fairly human interaction? A person-to-person kind of engagement. How do you replicate that at scale? Because I think that's one of the most difficult challenges for many organizations today.
Yeah, look, that's a really, really good point. I think you first of all have to understand just how difficult the subject matter is. So most people, when they think about pensions, when I interact with them, they either run a mile as soon as you say what you do, because it's just too difficult a conversation. A pensions, that's a very difficult subject. And then other times, the other interaction you have is, can you answer me a question? And then they start talking about the challenges they have. Think about the system. The system itself at the moment generates a new policy for you, a new pension every time you move employers. And when you fall into that system, you don't have to do anything. You go to the employer, you start going to work, and you get placed into the system, and contributions flow, and that happens. But when you approach retirement, or you start thinking about your future, you suddenly have to try and collect all of this stuff up, understand what it means, work out how to bring it together, and then work out how that's going to last you 20, 30 years in retirement. That is a pretty significant challenge you're placing on the shoulders of the population. So when I describe moments of truth, this is about how we show up as a business, not only in how responsive we are, and I think that is important. I think you can have, maybe for future generations, more online models, AI through the phone, all of this stuff. And that is a factor to embrace, and it's also a factor to worry about. But we'll need to morph our service models on. But what we find is you can't walk by. Someone just needs a conversation. Like that moment in the party, or, when you meet someone socially and they ask you what you do. they just need a little bit of help. Explain this to me in a way that I can understand it, that then I feel a little bit more able to deal with this significant challenge I have. So that's when I describe a moment of truth. It is that. And it's how your guidance, how the information that you can put out can possibly help people to make a good decision. I think there's a really important part here, though. Too many times I see engagement, as our pensions industry talks about, which is really important. It helps educate people. It helps guide people. Engagement's great. But there's two factors you have to remember. One, the population that will engage with you will always be the minority. So there is always a majority that don't engage and will contact you imminently before they look to retire. So your ability to help them get it right early on is very difficult. So that's where the system needs to be thought about more than the engagement process. The second element to engagement really is how you make sure engagement is there to help make a good decision for the person, not an extension of your sales process, which inevitably happens when you are talking to someone who's, finds the subject matter difficult. They are pretty vulnerable in the conversation to, okay, I'm engaging with you, but I'm now steering you into a bit of sales here where I get a few more contributions. I encourage you to consolidate, all sorts of things. And it can be all too easy in some of the way our industry works for that. So I think our purpose very much sits behind. We need to ensure people are making a great decision for them, even if that means they don't stay with us and they go somewhere else. As long as we've done our job and informed them in the right way and they make the decision, that's fine. Whereas I think you'll find most of the industry works on a completely different basis, which is actually how do I use engagement as a sales tool? Now, I'm not naive. We obviously want people to stay with us, but I think it's an important part of how you show up in a transparent way as a business in those moments and you help people. And if by extension you go, well, those people that don't engage, we need to educate them. Like financial education in schools needs to be better. Agreed. That'll take a little time to come through. But I also think it's a bit of a disservice because when I hear the pensions industry talk about that, it's as if we're putting all of the onus and all of the blame for it not working on the member, on the person, on the saver. Actually, sometimes we've got to hold a mirror up and go, how do we make the system better? So that when they don't engage, we're not placing them in a risky position. Or when they do engage, how do we ensure we show up and we don't go over, the sales process doesn't overtake that genuine need for them to understand what they need to know to make a good decision for them? That's the bit I like and I am increasingly working on to try and perhaps ask the question of the pensions industry a little bit more. What have we got to do to make the system better for people and not just keep insisting it's almost down to the saver to do everything here? I think there's a lot that we can do better ourselves.
Yeah. It does seem to me there's an idea in there that I find appealing, which is so I kind of come a bit from a analytical optimization, everything could be perfect sort of mindset. And yet sometimes I think the answer is not to try and make everything perfect for everybody individually, one by one, but to try and make it so it's, it's pretty good. It's good enough, even for the people who don't want to engage. That's fine. It'll be okay. It may not be the best, and if you really lent into it and spent time thinking, you might get a better answer. But even if you don't, it's still going to be okay. And it sounds like that's sort of where you're coming from.
It is, because you just can't expect everyone to engage, and if they do, you can't expect them to understand. I mean, pensions are inherently fairly simple underneath, but it's a difficult subject matter. And then so that's what I say, I find the flip side of that to say, well, actually, we just need to educate people through the system, the schools, so that they will be able to do this stuff. I find it a bit disrespectful, actually, because we should be saying to ourselves, what have we got to do to create that system you've just described? How do we get someone to say, look, if they don't engage, it's fine. They're not going to have harmed, and we're going to have been looking out for them. As we said, people more able, with guidance, with help, with support, to make these decisions in the right way for them. I think we have an important role to play to turn up with the right information and support that they will need. But I think also to recognise that I think over time, people will have more power in this system. At the moment, they're falling into it. But I think some point down the line, beyond 2030, perhaps, maybe there will be choice as to which provider your money accumulates with. Maybe the system will be changed further. And that's difficult when you're trying to build a default system where you want people to just fall into that. But there has to be something about if you're expecting people at the end of this to make a great decision and hoover 8 or 9 different pensions into one place and work out how to do retirement. Wouldn't it be better if they formed a relationship earlier with one provider that they were confident with, that they wanted to, and they could see how they were transparently delivering on value compared to everyone else in the market?
Not to get into too deep a technical discussion because we don't have time for it, but just if you've got an early sort of brief thought on this, how you're planning to respond to the government wanting you to find ways to invest more in things that are going to grow the economy.
So obviously behind the ambition of the government is to get these bigger schemes, default schemes, to invest more in the UK. We have signed something called the Mansion House Accord, which was a voluntary obligation to say we would get to about 10% of the default fund, investing in what's called private markets, but generally into infrastructure, property, could be in venture capital, growing businesses in the UK and overseas. Half of that 10% obligation is towards domestic, half is overseas. We signed that. We believe that's the right move. I actually think you could go easily beyond it. If you look to Australia, they are investing somewhere between 20 to even at extreme levels 35 to 40% of their asset bases into private market type activities because there's good long-term returns. They get great diversification, takes out some of the volatility of just tracking equity markets, even though, people will tell you the last 5 years have been great for equity markets. So I think it's the right direction of travel, actually. I think there is probably still some more work to do on the investing side of that and how we could operate a little bit more collaboratively as schemes. And there's no doubt, look, a bit of incentivization. Capital tends to follow incentives. It doesn't tend to follow words, as my CIO would say. So in which case, how do we ensure whatever we're doing with the money, the fundamental principle has to be, are we delivering benefits for members? In making this investment in the right way? Are we exceeding what we could do if we just went to a normal public market vehicle? I think the direction of travel is right. I think there's still some work to be done. The mandation thing is still bubbling through Parliament at the moment. We'll see where that lands. If it's much more aligned to where Mansion House Accord has already been signed, then I think that's a positive. I think that actually should help the industry move more in tune with what they've already voluntarily agreed to. But there's no doubt this is not just a UK issue. This is many governments finding, how do they invest now in this new nationalistic arena, invest into their own home economies in a way, and how do they leverage that? So it's interesting to see what the UK is doing, but there's still a bit to play through yet.
One of the things I hear in what you've just said, and you might have meant it and you might not have, but I hear in that a call, kind of request that other leaders like yourselves who are leading big organizations and interacting with a system, that they pay attention to the health of the system.
I agree, and particularly in financial services where people don't have a strong trust of financial services. Often we've seen with, other regulatory outcomes, it comes after the event, after something has happened. And I think we can be more proactive as a system participants to actually think about, how do we make this better so we don't get in those positions? It isn't about, for me, it's not about sending more and more disclosures to people just so they, we're legally covered if something goes wrong. It's not about, having more and more regulation, but I think it is about how you get the respective participants, whether it's policymakers, regulators, industry together, acting more collaboratively and actually going, this is how it should work for people, and therefore why don't we move in that direction? But I think it's tough. It's particularly tough in political cycles because this is probably the first time I've seen a government that will look beyond the walls of their 5 years. Right. So whatever you think of this government, what's happening in pensions right now is a long-term decision-making process that will go way beyond the benefit or outcome of this. It goes way beyond the term of this initial office. So I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like to see more industry participation here, because if we don't pay attention to it, we can sit there and just look at the things within our walls that matter to us.
Yeah. Patrick, that's such a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing both your own journey, the journey of People's Pension, People's Partnership, but also kind of the bigger thoughts, which again, I think apply well beyond the pension world. So thank you so much for being part of the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.